This is part 2 of the rules and procedures presentation. I was just explaining round robin sharing. I didn't mean to go so fast, but I could see my timer was counting down. The idea here is that round robin in a small group prevents one student from reading their entire list and stopping members 2, 3, and 4 from having anything to say. Round robin whole class ends up allowing all the very best ideas given in the small groups to be heard by the whole room and placed on the board. And if all the small groups are listening actively, it prevents repetition. Sometimes answers are very close and they're not exactly the same. So I always tell students, if you think it's different in any way, share it because it might be worth noting the difference. So if you have a central question like why do teachers need rules and procedures, this is a great way to get kids to think critically, to give them a chance to work individually, and then to let the whole class hear all the possible answers, and then you put them on the board so that all can see them. Sometimes when they're done, I'll take a picture and then I will turn that into some sort of graphic organizer that I'll then share with all the students. We're going to now move on to why teachers need rules and procedures. If you haven't stopped to think about that question and some of the possible answers, this is a good time to pause the video and ask yourself, if I was asked to write down some of the reasons why teachers need these, what do I think are the main reasons? So if you haven't done that, why don't you pause and get that scratch piece of paper and try to come up with at least 3 to 5 reasons why you think rules and procedures are essential for teachers. Let's go over some of the main reasons why. They will create physical and psychological security. In the last unit, we talked about the physical setting. So your rules and procedures do help create that physical security and psychological security that Fred Steele described. In addition, if you have rules and procedures set up at the beginning of the school year, you are defining the limits for students, so there's no reason for them to try to test the limits to figure out what they may and may not do. You're making acceptable behavior known. You're spelling it out to them. Now, if your rules are very general, that can be difficult to do with very young students. So the younger your students are, the more specific your expectations will need to be. But as students grow and develop, especially in late elementary and early middle school, you can begin to have expectations that are a little bit more broad. You still have to go over those and explain them to students so they understand what the expectations mean. And then especially as students are much older, then they pretty much know how to play school and they ought to understand what respectful looks like in a classroom. However, don't make the rookie mistake of assuming that even 12th graders know what be respectful looks like. You still have to break that down with them and imagine scenarios. I taught with a guy that had one rule: be appropriate. This was with 7th and 8th graders. And anytime something happened, he would just say, "Do you think that's appropriate for school?" And they would say, "No, not really." And that was pretty much the bar that he set throughout. When you define the limits, unacceptable behavior is also very clear and easy to identify. Rules and procedures create predictability. Students know what to do and what not to do, especially in entry and exit procedure. Students know what to do when they arrive in your classroom. Students know what you expect them to do before they leave your classroom. The environment for students becomes very comprehensible and it's not as confusing. And this can also add to the physical and psychological security because students know how what you do, how you do it, and what you expect them to do, and you keep that pretty consistent. Our next idea, it aids in your consistency. This helps you, especially with rules, it helps you to be fair so that you are expecting all students to play by the same set of expectations, and you're not letting some students get away with things that other students are not allowed to do. And ultimately, you want students to manage their own behavior. You want to teach students the expectations, be consistent about putting those into place and holding students to them, and over time, students will begin to manage themselves because they know what you will and will not allow in your classroom. A few more reasons: it's going to save you instructional time. You should be stopping to deal with behavior issues less. You should be having to stop and tell people how to turn in papers and where supplies are located. And fewer disruptions should mean more engagement and more opportunities for students to learn. Just a great general principle about being a teacher and a classroom manager is for you to try to always be a step ahead, being proactive and imagining, here's what I want students to do. How will I get them all to do this in a way that is safe and effective? Planning that and trying to carry it out rather than trying to solve things in the moment. Because with kids and humans in general, if there's not a plan, a little bit of chaos can ensue, and people are doing things in their own ways, going different directions. There are times when that's okay, like a creative assignment, perhaps. You do want your students to go their own way, but if we're trying to get to the media center and my classroom is at the end of the hallway and we have to pass 9 classrooms to get to the media center, then I don't want there to be a lot of noise and teachers mad at me because my kids are rowdy, because when I get in trouble, my emotions might come to the surface and I might be reactive. Instead, let me think about these kids. How old are they? How do I get 30 kids down a long hallway quietly when they're 10? We're probably going to have to line up and we're going to be silent in the hallway. And I've got to explain that to them in advance and tell them my expectations and maybe even the consequence for not following through. That's me being proactive. And a rookie error you want to avoid: never assume students of any age know what is expected or how you want something done. Even 11th and 12th graders, you're going to have to say, here's the expectation, here's how we do it. With older students, you can announce the expectation, be respectful, and you can ask, what does that look like? You've been in school 9 years. Let's talk about what it looks like to be respectful in a classroom. And they may roll their eyes and think, oh, we've heard this. The issue is if you don't say it in that room to them and you don't explain it, then you leave yourself open for a student to say, she never told us that. He never told me that. He handed me this piece of paper that had rules on it, but he didn't tell me about them. How am I supposed to know what he means by that? So it is important that during the first week of school, you make your expectations very, very clear to students, and then you begin consistently abiding by them. I'm going to share with you at the end of this part of the presentation the rules of rulemaking, and these are from this textbook by the Wongs. These are 5 rules for how you should make effective rules or expectations for your classroom. So the first rule of rulemaking is to write general rules that apply to a lot of possible behaviors. Your classroom management plan part 2, the top half of that is for you to set up or to come up with a set of classroom expectations or rules. When you write those, I do want you to follow the rules of rulemaking. So let's do general rules that apply to lots of behaviors. Also, limit the number of rules 3 to 5. 4 to 6 is probably okay. Anything more than 6, you need to stop and think, what am I doing here? Because people just can't remember large lists of rules, and the more rules you put out there, the more students will think, wow, you really have a lot of rules. You don't want to have a lot of rules. I taught with someone that had 22 rules. She added each year. That's how it got to 22 as things came up. And she gave these out to students on the first day of school. And I think she thought, I've made this airtight. But what ended up happening usually is kids came up with things that were not in her list because the list was so specific. And there were so many of them. And the only reason I knew about this is they complained about her to me on the first day of school. And they told me, we're so glad you have 3 rules because she has 22. And so you don't want to be the teacher that has all those rules. Number 3 is the most difficult to get your head around. State your rules positively. This means for you to describe what you expect in your rule or expectation rather than what you will not tolerate. And to do this, you're going to not use any negative words. So come prepared is an excellent rule. It's short, it's generic, it could apply every day of the school year versus do not ask to go to your locker. Here's the negative language that you want to avoid. Be courteous, general, applies all the time, versus don't interrupt. And there's that negative language. Again, number 3 is the trickiest to make sure that you do correctly. The trick is to describe what you want them to do rather than what you don't want them to do, and avoid any of that negative language. Number 4, this one I won't really get to see so much in your work that you do for the classroom management plan, but when you become a teacher in your own classroom, or if you are a teacher, it's important that you post those expectations on a wall, hand them out to students, and teach those rules. And that's what I was referring to earlier when you talk about these expectations with students, really emphasizing the why. What's the rationale for this expectation, teacher? Explain to us why we should do this. And the answer shouldn't be because I said so. You should have a legitimate reason why you want students to do these things. I would get them involved in these conversations. There are teachers that let students help them make the rules. I think you've already read an article that mentions that. I've done that before. I didn't do it until I had about 4 years of teaching experience. Someone had warned me that that can get out of hand if you don't really know what you're doing and you don't set up the parameters carefully. But I have done it, and I'm going to show you some pictures of what I came up with students. Be explicit. In other words, when you're explaining, be courteous, be very explicit about what that means. So you would need to go over that these are the things we would do to be courteous, and these are some things we would not do because these things are not courteous, and get students involved in those conversations. And even when you're talking about your expectations, try not to say no and don't and never and not too often. Really focus on what students should do. I'm not saying you can't mention those things, but again, the first week of school, students are really profiling you. What kind of person is this? Do I want to be in this classroom? Do I feel like I have some say and some freedom and it's a happy place? Or is this basically a kind of, a place where I'm told what to do at every moment? Think back to those different styles of teaching that we went over the very first week. And too much no can give students a feeling that this class is all about what we can't do. And then very important that you know your school or building level rules and that you're consistent with those. If your school has rules about food and gum and water in the classroom, then I think that you need to follow that, and you shouldn't be allowing students to do things that are not consistent with the school rules. These are the rules that I used in my classroom for a long time, and I tried to get mine down to 4 verbs. And when I presented these to students, they saw these 4 verbs first, and they didn't really see much else. These were 7th graders, so we would talk about, what do you think I mean by these 4 verbs? And then after we had had a conversation about what I mean, and what does it look like to be prepared, and what does it look like if you're not prepared, then I gave them this handout. And you can, I'm going to click this and let you see it a little bit more closely. So this is a real document that I dug up from the late 90s, where I was identifying myself and my grade level, the grading scale for this class, pretty much how will the grades be made up, and then here's my big set of classroom expectations, the 4 big verbs, and some explanation of what I mean. You'll notice there's a little bit of negative language there. If I was doing this again, I'd fix that. And then I have a set of consequences. What will happen if you do not follow through with these? Some statements that basically say, if you do something severe, you're going to go to the office. If you don't do your homework, I gave students noon detention. And then I had a very small set of kind of procedures here at the bottom, some specifics about things that they need to make sure they always do. So I gave every student one of these on the first day of school. Sometimes I printed them on cardstock and in bright colors, and we put them in our binders. I would punch holes in them so they could go right in those rings of their binders, and we did that during the first week. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this list that I found on the wall of a classroom, and we're going to apply the 5 rules of rule making to these 9, because 9 is more than the rules of rule making allow. In addition, you can see that there's some negative language included in this list. So what could this look like if we cleaned it up and we applied the rules of rule making? And that's where we'll begin on the next video.